All right, welcome to the first lesson in VFX for Motion. I'm excited you're here. We're going to talk in this lesson about VFX and motion, and we're going to talk about both of them in relationship to how your eye and how the camera see the world. And those are very similar, but they're a little bit different. In this course, we're going to focus on visual effects, and we're going to do it at the level you would do if you were a professional visual effects compositor working in After Effects. Now, the compositor, if you don't know, is the person on the VFX crew who assembles the shot. They're usually the last in line. The only one after them would be the colorist or whoever's determined the final color look, that kind of thing, and of course the editor. But the compositor is taking all the elements. They could be 3D, matte paintings, and of course shot footage of various kinds, or even completely fabricated elements, and assembling them all to make the viewer believe at some level that what the viewer is seeing is real and was taken with a camera. Now, sometimes that literally means fool the viewer into believing that the shot had no digital effects done to it at all. Other times it's kind of obvious that the shot is just too fantastic not to have involved visual effects, and yet the audience still wants to believe. As a motion designer, you're keeping people emotionally in your story, and as a visual effects artist, you're really doing the exact same thing. So let's talk a second about the camera, which is going to be the subject of today's lesson. Well, actually, let's just get into it, and we'll be talking about the camera throughout the lesson. Broadly speaking, the job of the VFX artist is to keep you engaged, usually in a story. If not a story, a feeling, a theme, whatever's being created. Usually a story, though. And at the end, we may wonder what the visual effects artist did and how they did it. In motion graphics, by contrast, we would be doing exactly the same thing, and often just make the viewer think, wow, how the heck did they do that? We see more and more examples every day, not only in a feature film, but in every kind of video that captures your attention, where it's hard to say whether what we're looking at is motion graphics or visual effects. The main difference, as far as I'm concerned, is that a motion designer can't succeed without understanding the rules of motion, which is to say animation and design, and that could be animation of the point of view, which has a lot in common with the camera. Now, the VFX compositor can certainly benefit from understanding the rules of animation and motion, but the compositor truly cannot succeed without understanding the rules of the camera. So, although we'll be working with footage from a camera throughout this course, in this lesson, I thought it would be helpful to give you a firm basis just in how the camera works with light and how After Effects works with the images those cameras create and with light. The goal here is not just to be accurate or get things right or something really boring like that. In my opinion, it's to create an image that could be considered cinematic. I love this word, cinematic. A cinematic image not only looks as if a camera captured it, it tells a story by what it includes and, more importantly sometimes, what it leaves out. Images that I would consider cinematic most often, first of all, have fewer colors, maybe just 2 or 3 dominant colors, than images you would just pull out your phone and capture. Less depth of field, fewer frames per second than what you would see on, say, reality TV. They often have less image data, so you might have a widescreen image, which is effectively cropping information above and below. These images might include exotic lens effects like bokeh blur, which comes from shallow depth of field, or various other types of lens distortion. Again, reducing what we're actually able to see in the frame. As with motion graphics, some things we see blow us away by showing something we've never seen before, and others are almost invisible and may, at most, make us wonder, after we're done watching them, how did they do that? What made what I just saw feel even more real than reality? A professional camera to capture a moving image, which these days it's a dilemma whether to call it a film camera, a video camera or something else, it effectively has three distinct pieces that gather the image. It has a separate lens, and from separate I mean you can change out the lens, and that lens has its own specific characteristics and adjustable settings. Some of the lenses might be zoom lenses that can have variable lengths, others might be primes that have only one length, and directors of photography, DPs, will know the characteristics of each of them so they can choose the right tool for the job. Second, the camera will have an adjustable shutter and aperture. So the shutter determines how long light is exposed to a frame, and the aperture determines how much light is allowed through. And finally, there is the image gathering device, the sensor or back inside the part of the camera that otherwise is getting no other light exposed to it. And that sensor or film frame has a specific size. Now, is that all you need to create a professional quality motion picture image? Well, not quite. You need light outside the camera. With professional cameras, you also generally need some knowledge about how to handle that image. Unlike consumer or even prosumer cameras, images you get off of a professional camera are generally going to have some decisions yet to be made in post-production, and these days those all happen on the computer, and they may very well happen in After Effects. There's no way that you can be at the level of After Effects artist that you already are to be in this course and not be an intelligent human being. And you've probably had some experience shooting with a camera, and you probably also took biology in high school or junior high and learned some things about vision. But let's just explore for a moment how the eye works and how the camera works and kind of what the relationship is there. Your eyes also depend on light. With no light, there's no vision. They have a lens, just one lens. They don't have lots of lenses that create all the kind of optical phenomena that a camera lens does. The recording device, or the back of your eye, is the retina, which has, as you probably remember from junior high or high school biology, rods and cones recording respectively brightness and color. Those transfer the image via an optic nerve to the visual system of the brain, which is a much more abstract concept than an image with pixels. Now, admittedly, I'm kind of a nerd on this topic, but it's fun, in my opinion, to consider the similarities shared by eyes and cameras. All right, so we all know that the eye can focus at various distances. If you look at something in the foreground, you go a little cross-eyed, and things in the background can look blurry. Similarly, we know we have an aperture in our eye, so if you're somewhere bright and you go somewhere dark, your iris opens up to let in more light. Or if you step out into the sunshine after working all morning in the dark studio, you might have to squint and you might see a vignette effect from squinting. We'll get into that. But you may not know that your eye actually has something like a frame rate, a refresh rate, and what's called persistence of vision. I have a ceiling fan right here, and if I stare at it while it's spinning, I see blur. And the reason for that can only be that the image is exposed to my eye and imprinting in my visual system over a period of time. And it's not an unlimited period of time. There's a certain amount of motion blur that I see, and it's consistent. So I'm not saying that we can measure the exact frame rate of your nervous system, but the fact that you perceive reality that way is very interesting, because it's also the basis on which moving images actually work. You're presented with a series of still images, and you're asked to believe that they are in full motion. And it so happens that the ones that are at 24 frames a second are right near the threshold, the low threshold of what you can still believe is full motion. Now, I don't like to go down too many rabbit holes during a lesson, but in this case, we're going to have a couple of them. Less than a mile away from where I was actually born on the Stanford University campus is the spot where the first quote-unquote moving image was captured. The guy's name was Edward Muybridge, and you've probably seen this footage. It's a galloping horse, and it was taken by a series of tripwires to settle a bet that Leland Stanford, who with his wife founded the university, had about whether a horse's hooves, feet, leave the ground while it gallops. Now, by today's standards, that's a ridiculous bet, and it should tell you some things about human evolution that nobody would take that bet today. But the result was not only that they got this series of photos, but they realized that by playing them in sequence, because of persistence of vision and the ability of the mind to see a sequence of images and make them into a moving image, you could recreate a moving image. But in fact, what motion blur tells us is we are experiencing persistence of vision all the time. Most, basically all, other applications that do compositing don't natively work with a set frame rate or composition size the way After Effects does. So if we look at Nuke or Fusion, moving images are natively handled as numbered sequences with a frame rate that's arbitrary until you set one, and the same goes for the frame boundary. It is only there when you actually set it, otherwise your elements are kind of out in space. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's more that way than in After Effects. Now that sounds more flexible, and it is, but by being more rigid, After Effects is actually more reliable for animation. So one of the earliest and smartest, in my opinion, decisions made when After Effects was first designed by Dave Simons and his team was that time would be king. QuickTime was the first video platform that was designed never to skip audio, but instead to skip frames. So audio would keep running in correct time, and if it was really glitching, then it would still maintain the pace of the audio and not go out of sync between audio and video. And Dave was adamant that After Effects run the same way. So this means in After Effects that you can in fact mix different frame rates together in a comp. They retain their relationship to the beat of the clock. You can even use a thing called posterized time, or using the frame rate of an embedded composition to mix two things together. You're also free to take footage that was shot at one frame rate and put it into a comp of a different frame rate. Now I am excited to jump into After Effects for the first time in this course. Ooh. And we have a very non-standard interface, and we're just dealing with a still image, which happens to be in HD format, 1920 by 1080, but could have been anything. Because all I've done is stick a gradient ramp effect here, and I just inverted it. Let me describe to you now what you are seeing here. So I have open to the left of my image Lumetri scopes, which you may or may not have ever opened up. And I have an info panel up here, which has a lot of negative space because that's just the AUI. One thing you could do is just float it like that. This is a setup that I would use in After Effects. I would have my info panel available, and I might be checking scopes. And the reason for that is something that really doesn't come up in motion graphics for the most part, which has to do with bit depth and to a certain extent with color spaces. And right now I want to talk about bit depth. In your project panel down here at the bottom, you will see one of three settings. You'll see 8, 16, or 32 bits per channel. And there was some change in my scopes there, which I'm going to get to. But all I'm doing is holding down the Option key, because I'm on a Mac, and clicking on that. You can also go to your project settings, which are here with that shortcut, under the Color tab. And again, you can set the depth there as well. But I tend to use this Option click on here. So many artists just work at 8 bits per channel and never think about it. And likewise, most artists, I'm just going to say not even many, but most, are going to leave the info panel set to whatever the bit depth is here. So, as is probably familiar to you from your years sitting in front of a monitor, what we call pure white is RGB 255, and pure black is a 0. And that's that. Well, now let's blow your mind a little bit. So, first of all, in my info panel, I tend to keep mine on decimal. And in decimal space, pure white, which we would actually call not pure white, but monitor white, the whitest white your monitor can display, is at 1, and black is at 0. You could, if you prefer, also choose %, which is the same diff, just 2 decimal points difference, so it's 100% down to 0. But the reason I like decimal is this is how color is actually computed in the real world, on your camera, and when After Effects works with linear light. Now, what the heck is that? Well, we're going to work our way up to that. So first of all, I am in 8 bits per channel. And we'll go back to my gradient effect here. And so you're pretty familiar with what happens in 8 bits per channel, or some of it. So let's just take a look at that. I have a curves effect here. If I pull down, let's say on the output white, there, the white level, everything dims down, and in my scopes you can see kind of what happens. But something interesting that's happening is you can see things getting spaced further apart in these lower colors. Now, to get you familiar with what I mean by lower colors, I'll just pick a second point here and notice on the right here, that's a histogram. So if I pull up on it, you're going to see more values toward the top, and that is monitor 1 and 0 down here. Or I can go the other direction with it, and I can even crush things, right? And then you see the spike right down at the bottom. And it's not very easy to see because it's just 1 pixel, but there it is. Now, what happens, and you know the answer to this, what happens if I pull down on the gamma, the middle, and then set another curves, and then I pull up? I'm going to go kind of hard on this. Now, did I end up with the same image that I started with? Let's compare. Nope. Things have gotten a little crushed. And actually, what I can do, close those, and I'm going to apply a levels effect just to make this a little easier to see. Levels and curves are somewhat interchangeable, and we're going to get into that a lot. So what I'm doing is kind of crushing this image. Let's just go with that. What I'm really doing here is creating some really ugly banding so that you can see it. That is banding. And the other thing that you saw is even though I went up and down, I lost a lot of my shades of gray. It went much more contrasty to black and white. And that seems like no surprise. But let's just take a look what happens at other bit depths. So in 16 bits per channel, the banding is no longer apparent. I'll just undo and redo. And both in my histograms, which really are just approximating pixel by pixel. So for example, this scope is showing me that I just have a lot less color data down in the dark areas because of how I push this thing. But they're clear banding on the image and in the scopes. And here, banding is removed. That is basically the reason that 16-bit per channel exists. So 16 versus 8, it might slow you down a little bit, but not a whole lot. And it is going to get rid of banding in situations where you have subtle gradients. Now in visual effects, that would be things like shadows. Obviously in design, you'd come up against these two. So you may have used 16-bit, or you may even work in a studio where 16 is kind of the standard. Again, it might slow things down a little bit, but it's not literally like half as fast as 8 bits per channel, or even mathematically that's not even right, because in fact there's 8 times more data. But I digress. Let's take a look at what happens if we go to 32. Oh, okay. So 32, we still have no banding. But if I undo back to 16, notice there was this kind of hard stop of white here. And at 32, that's even subtler, and there's some roll off here in the histogram. It's not really clear what's happening. So let me just start over. So I did the thing with curves, and you weren't really expecting that to round trip. Let's try it a different way. Let's try the exposure effect. So exposure is the equivalent of, on a camera, opening up or closing a stop of light. So raising exposure by 1 would be like opening up the aperture of the camera 1 stop. So if you were at f2.8 and you open up to f1.4, you went up a stop. Same if you went from 5.6 to 2.8. I know the numbers are weird, but that's how they work on a camera. On our digital device, it is a lot more straightforward. Black is still 0, and white at the higher exposure is not double. But if I bypass linear light conversion, then it is. So what the heck is going on here? Because the other thing you'll notice is that my white level now went up. That used to be my whitest white there at 100 and over here on my histogram, and now they've gone up, and if I raise the exposure more, they're going to go up more. And not only that, now it looks like my image is completely blown out, right? I'll apply another exposure effect and go down in exposure, and it turns out my image is still there, just as before I ever started. No difference at all. What the heck is going on? Getting away from playing around with gradients and into a real world example, here is an HDRI image. Now, if you supervise on set, one of the main things that you're called upon to deliver, if there's any 3D, CG type stuff being generated at all, is a reference, usually where your talent is standing, of what the lighting is like. Here we've got the interior of an underpass, and what we have, this image is twice as wide as it is tall. You could project this into VR space and you would have a 360 view, and that's why it looks all kind of weird like that. But the real important salient point here is this was shot in HDR, and so it looks dark on the inside, and the exterior at each end of the tunnel here looks completely blown out. If we look over here at the scope, and here I have switched this to just a waveform view. Waveform is showing levels across the image, so where the two openings are, you see more hot white values, or not just white, but things that go above 100% white. And if I move my cursor over that area in my info panel, you can see values that go actually above 3. So that's many times above pure monitor white. What is the point of that? For that, I'm going to zoom in. So there's a loss of detail on the interior, and there's blown out detail on the exterior. So again, with an exposure effect applied, if I raise this, you're going to see the result in that histogram, and you can now see bricks. They don't look amazing, but there wasn't a lot of color to them on the inside, so they look like bricks. I mean, they look not that bad, considering they were only lit by these little fluorescent lights and some ambient lighting in the background. But the really interesting stuff, to me at least, is if we go the other direction. If I come down in exposure, and I'm going to do it a lot. Oh, wait a minute. This is not what we're used to. So if I come down enough in light levels, all this detail emerges from the sky. And if I turn off the effect, you can see now the colors outside look quite natural, even a little bit drab. Now, that's kind of exciting, because let's just take a look at what happens if we switch this to 8 bits per channel, or even 16, and I turn back on that exposure adjustment. Things just go gray. And this is what we're used to, let's face it. Same with, I'll do it in the project panel this time, 16 bits per channel. No difference. those whites and highlights are not recoverable. You can see where they are clipping. And so 8-bit and do backwards to 32-bit, which you can tell because now, once again, my highlight values are extending above this 1 or 100% line right here. They're well above it, and bringing the exposure down into monitor range below 1 or 100 makes what were seemingly purely white pixels not turn gray, but actually reveal all that detail that we could see was in there. Now, at one level, if you haven't seen HDR images adjusted on a computer before, this has got to be blowing your mind. At another level, all you're seeing is light behave the way it does in the natural world. So while we're not at a point yet where we're ready to always be working with natural light images on our computers, just the fact that the possibility is there is something really fascinating to be aware of, and something that definitely comes into play when you work in visual effects. Why don't we work this way all the time? Well, for one thing, the images tend to be kind of heavy. In Nuke, the default is to work with multi-channel EXR images, and visual effects companies just take it on that they're going to use cameras and renderers that are going to make use of that format. But for most of us, that becomes a hardship, not to mention that these are still sequence image formats, not moving image formats like QuickTime. And there are workarounds, but that's the thing, workarounds. So to show you how weird things can get in this world, we haven't really even delved into things like 1.0 gamma color blending and working spaces. So a working space you could think of as show me the image as if it were. So let's choose Aeroflex Tungsten, an Adobe profile, and whoa, things got weird. But if you look at my RGB values in info, they are the same as they were before I made that change. So what's happening is After Effects is showing me what it would look like if this image were converted to tungsten log for the Aeroflex. And that is a little hard to wrap your head around. And likewise, let's go back to our gradient without that adjustment on it. And there are more mild profiles you can choose, like sRGB or Rec 709. But I'm also going to linearize the working space. And now I'm going to duplicate this gradient layer and use add mode here. And so now add is working mathematically like it should. 1.0 white doubled is 2.0. And again, this internally is how light is calculated, and it's how it works in the real world. If you double exposed an image, it would be twice as bright. That's how it works on a camera. But that's not what we're used to. And if instead we turn that off, again, the image doesn't look the same. The peak white values are the same, but the colors don't blend the same. Or if we choose blend with a 1.0 gamma, now the peak whites are not going to 2. Now, understanding why that is and which one you want for which case gets into kind of a can of worms. And meanwhile, all of the color management control that is implied with all of these profiles depends on calibrated monitors and a whole pipeline that embeds these color profiles. TIFF images do it, Photoshop images do it, but it's far from universal. So there are quite a few obstacles here. So for your purposes, the main thing to know about HDR is why it exists and the fact that you have it if you basically want this experience of turning down the lights and recovering details. And I can do it even with this exposure control. If you ever wondered what this was for, you'll see me use this for other purposes in the course, like flashing low areas to check grain. But in an HDR image, I can also use it to just see what kind of detail is out there without any adjustment being applied to the image. And in fact, this is just a preview control, so it doesn't render. So this is still what the image is actually looking like, and that's still what the values in my info panel are reflecting. Confused yet? If you ever find yourself working at a high-end visual effects studio that can afford it, you're going to find artists working in Nuke. Nuke is not exactly popular software, but it's extremely common at major visual effects houses that are working on films with budgets in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not to say that we haven't gotten shots done in those films in After Effects as well. And it's certainly not to say that After Effects isn't far more popular worldwide. But my point is, if you find yourself in a studio with Nuke users, they are working in linear light compositing because that's the default mode. And what After Effects does is effectively shield you from that world. The other thing to really be wary of from the beginning when building an After Effects project using live action footage is the pixel dimensions of the source. So a lot of the footage we'll be using in the course is from the Red camera, and it will have various sizes, but a lot of it is going to be what we call 4K. If I drag this into a comp, my comp automatically matches the footage. So if I say Command K, I see that this is 3840 by 2160, 69 aspect ratio. That's very standard. And in some cases, you might think, well, that means my whole project should work at that resolution. Well, not necessarily. We're actually, for the most part, aiming to output HD, which is 1920 by 1080, or half of what you see here. So I could set that here. Probably the ideal way to do it is to set a composition that just matches and call this one plate. And I'm not saying I do this throughout the course, but this is the way we would do it at a VFX facility. And then put that one into another comp. And here I could then scale it down to 50%. And I could even change this comp size to be 1920 by 1080. And then I could either work with it scaled here, or in fact, I could then call this plate scaled, and now it's as if my source was all 1920. Now, for something like a green screen, that extra resolution could help you get a nicer key out of the footage. So I'm not necessarily saying you should do that. But the advantage of this is the flexibility of it. So sometimes you get temp footage that you have to work with to start that's not full res. And you might drop that into a comp at the resolution eventually you're expecting to get, say 4K, and then you could scale it up here. And then when you replace in the real footage later, it doesn't cause a train wreck. One other thing I'll say about comp settings for the footage you're going to get is it's going to have weird start frames. And you can just go in here and change that to 0 or 1. 0 is kind of going to be our standard here. And then you don't have to deal with these crazy frame numbers. And of course you can hold down Command and click on time to see things in seconds. Usually we only work that way when we're working definitely with televisual video for, say, a commercial that has to be a certain number of seconds long. It can be helpful to think in terms of seconds, but in visual effects, we generally work with frames. So we've all erroneously, one time or another, started a project or a comp in the wrong size and had to scale it up. And there are provisions for that, including a couple of scripts that help you keep everything in your comp kind of aligned. But when it comes to getting the wrong frame rate, you can get away with that if you're doing pure animation. But when you're using moving footage that was shot at a specific frame rate, you can really get into trouble. You're probably aware already, but if you've only worked in animation, you may have mostly experienced the flexibility of frame rates in After Effects, let's talk about the downside when it comes to footage. So here I have a 3D track of a nicely matched comp and footage. So because the footage is running at the same frame rate as the comp, the 3D track has a surface that's sticking really nicely to it. And then here's an example where I've set my comp to mismatch. So it's running at 30 frames per second, and the footage is 23.976. And so there's going to be a problem. And if I zoom in, you can kind of see it wobbling. And the issue is that the frames are rolling, they're rounding because they're not exact. You can see the keyframes are falling in between actual frames of the thing. That will cause a train wreck in some cases. It can be great with animation, but with particularly procedural visual effects that set keyframes like this, it's going to pretty much make stuff unusable. And so definitely beware of that. Also, in the just so you know category, these weird frame rates that you see in here, 23.976, 29.97, 59.94, those are the common ones for video in any country that had the NTSC television system, such as the United States. Depending on who you talk to, there was either a clever engineering solution or actually a misguided hack that made it seem like sound wasn't going to work unless it varied a little bit from the 120 hertz rate of electricity. And so they just finagled it a little bit. And it's sad that when digital formats and digital television came around, they didn't get rid of this. So we've still got it. It dates back to the 1950s. There are the more sane 24 FPS, which is what film traditionally runs at. There's 25, which is the standard in most of Europe, where they had the PAL system that was much more sensible. 50 is double 25. 30 you're almost never going to see, but for a long time it was just the default in After Effects, so be careful. And I'll show you where to be careful in a second. 120 is becoming kind of the high-speed standard. Who knows what will happen with that? But you may run into some 120 FPS footage. If you're importing an image sequence, that's where you have to be especially careful. With any source footage in After Effects, you can go into interpret footage and change the frame rate here. So I could change this 23.976 footage to be 24, or heck, I could make it 60, and that would really change how it plays back. Well, you can't really tell with this footage, but 24 playing back at 60, that's going to run a lot faster. But with an image sequence, you have to set it and you have to be deliberate about it. So make sure that you get that to whatever it actually should be in here. And if you're working on a whole project where all the footage is going to be kind of that frame rate, you can go into Preferences, Import, and set your sequence footage to be that frame rate. Very helpful versus the default of 30, which again is almost never what you want. One more side note, I hope you never run up against this, but notice also in comp settings there's pixel aspect ratio. Square pixels, as you know, is what you have on your computer monitor, but there are cameras out there in the world, or there used to be, that would generate non-square pixels. This was a hack, basically, for back when cameras just couldn't handle that much data. And it started with television, where non-square pixels gave you more resolution in one direction than the other. It was clever enough, but a real pain in the butt. And so there's all these different aspect ratios. Now, if I choose a format like, let's say, DVC Pro, suddenly I'm in non-square pixels and my image looks squashed. There's a little toggle here to make it look normal again. It compensates to make the image fit the pixel aspect of my monitor. I'm now looking at pixels that are non-square. It's craziness, and I hope that you never have to get into it. Overcranking is the DP or cinematographer's term for shooting at high speed. High speed gives you slow motion. You need more frames to create a slow motion effect. One of the fun things about working in film is that there's terminology that goes way back in time. So if you work on a set, you'll learn, for example, that a C-47 is a clothespin. Undercranking and overcranking are terms that go all the way back to, believe it or not, the hand-cranked camera. And so literally, overcranking would have been the way to create slow motion footage, and undercranking would have been a way to amp up the action by actually making it play faster. And believe it or not, undercranking was quite a bit more popular back in the day. They would even have projectionists who were also hand cranking who would overcrank to make the footage more exciting. Now, these terms are still in use, as are the techniques. Obviously, we'll overcrank or shoot high-speed footage if we want to speed ramp it, and we'll even undercrank slightly in certain cases to amp up action. So fight sequences sometimes benefit from a little bit of quiet, secretive undercranking. Visual effects high-speed photography tends to have a sweet spot at around 300 FPS. High speed is so compelling that these guys, the slow-mo guys on YouTube, have become one of the biggest channels just by thinking of more things they can shoot at high speed. And they'll sometimes go up to frame rates in the tens of thousands that we more typically associate with scientific visualization. Not usually what you're going to use, but if you need it, there are cameras you can rent out there that will do it. You also have to think about lighting because lighting has cycles, so hire a DP to shoot that way. Okay, we've covered detail about how technically the camera operates. Now I want to get into some of the most fun and interesting things about cameras, which have to do with optics and the lens. Camera lenses introduce camera optics, a field so complicated not everything can even be explained or modeled by physics or science the way light and lenses behave. We do have plugins to simulate this. One main reason we have different lenses is that they introduce a different perspective, predominantly due to the length of the lens compared with the size of the sensor. So for the long lens, we can talk about a number of classic movies, The Conversation, Rear Window, but I would point you to the movies of Sergio Leone, who mastered use of the telephoto or zoom lens. He used this lens to create a good deal of compression between the foreground, in the case of the sequence you're watching, and extreme close-up, which was actually probably shot from a few feet away, and the background mountains. This flattens perspective. It changes the look of faces, and in this case it gave almost a claustrophobic feeling to this awesome standoff. The opposite of the zoom lens is the wide or fisheye lens, and for this we're looking at the films of Jean-Pierre Jeunet, specifically in this case Amélie, which is one of my favorite visual effects movies of all time, which is not even perceived as a VFX movie. Wide-angle lenses are typically of a length in the single digit or teens, depending on the size of the sensor. And there's a relationship between those that we're not even getting into right here. And a wider lens is going to have kind of a fisheye appearance in the front. And this curved lens creates a wider point of view. This will make the subject feel further away. In the case of Jeunet, he would shoot closer to the actors to make it look almost like they're in this kind of crazy, distorted fishbowl world. And it's used for, in this case, comedic effect and a little bit of pathos, and also to bring out the sort of strong facial characteristics of these character actors. The fisheye lens enhances and even distorts perspective, and straight lines will go curved with what is known as pincushion distortion. As I mentioned, there are fundamentally two types of lens. There is the prime and the zoom lens. If you have a prime lens, or if you don't want to zoom your zoom lens, your method of changing the shot composition is with the push. And this is generally considered the more elegant and filmic way to reframe a shot. It implies someone is in the frame looking at the subject, and it changes the perspective between objects. So you would do this often with a dolly. The zoom is a camera move that goes in and out of fashion. It's associated with documentaries. The Office used them a lot to remind you that there was a crew quickly zooming around to get whatever action was unfolding on the scene. And so some people like it as a style, other people just rely on it because they're shooting a documentary and they have no choice. Robert Altman was famous for shooting in this style. Here I am showing some zooms of Kubrick, who I think used it to a different effect, where he kind of, I think, liked the slight creepiness of the filmmaker showing you the scene and letting you kind of study it in this slightly artificial feeling way. But that's just my impression of it. You can, of course, make your own. The thing to know about a zoom is it does not change your perspective. So it is effectively like cropping in on the image. The relationship of objects in the scene stays exactly the same. Incidentally, while we're talking about Kubrick, he also liked to use dolly moves, so much so that he was one of the earliest users of the Steadicam, which lets you do a dolly without putting the camera on tracks, which was very necessary to follow Danny around the Overlook Hotel on his big wheel. So even working 3D software, you've been exposed to the difference a longer or wider lens will make. But there's a whole other area to lenses that's really fun to get into that the computer doesn't really have, and that's lens optics, specifically what happens when light passes through the lens and what can happen to make it more interesting, more beautiful, and way stranger. When we talk about lens distortion, the first thing that usually comes to mind is this kind of shot. These are extreme wides taken with a fisheye lens, literally a lens with sort of a fisheye-like protrusion to gather more scene data, and it causes things to curve. These are stills, and they are provided by unsplash.com, which is a Creative Commons site. That means the artists listed here, David, Phil, and Sergio, gave us permission to play with these and show them to you. So I'm going to do just that. If you want to comp into a shot like this, or quote unquote correct the distortion, you could. So here is the optics compensation effect, which is built into After Effects. And I will tell you there are third-party options as well, but we'll just look at this one. And so what I'm able to do is kind of dial in until the straight lines look straight. And if I want a reference for that, I can turn on a grid. And if in fact it's a shot like this where things are kind of lining up with the horizon like that, then that can work. Obviously, now I'm kind of still in distorto land, and when people talk about removing fisheye distortion, I'm not generally a fan. I think that shot actually looks kind of cool, and you probably, if you took that shot, you hopefully had the intention of having it look like that. Not all wide lenses distort this way. These, again, are the extreme. And the way you can measure for it is if it's not lining up with the horizon, you can use, for example, the beam effect that lets you draw a straight line in the scene. And then let's just turn this one on because I already kind of dialed it in. And in this case, I mean, if you wanted, you could make that your shot. If this just looked too stylized and this is what you want, great. Now, if you want to comp into a shot like this, there is some stuff involved. So here is the optics compensation effect, and I'm actually starting from scratch on this one. So I've got my grid up, and if I raise field of view, things get more distorted. So what I actually want is to reverse that and I'm actually paying attention to that curve in the front there, which is kind of like a horizon line. But things throughout the scene that kind of give me an indication. So somewhere in here looks pretty good. And now if I want to comp into that, what I do is match that. So I've made a solid that's full frame, and that's important. You need to compose full frame. So if I had a bunch of elements, I'd need to do this in a pre-comp. And then I take the optics compensation effect that I had already set to remove the distortion and paste it into that layer or comp. And then when I remove it from the source, it didn't work because I forgot to unreverse it. And boom, let's just turn off our guides. And wow, look at that. So you could actually match items into a moving shot that was undistorted and then distort the whole thing. And it actually works. While we're here, there's other types of lens distortion that I want to talk about. And one that you almost wouldn't call distortion, but you should be aware of, is soft edges. So this solid right now has no edge thresholding or feather at all. And it's not quite right. Even from far away, you can tell, I mean, it's also bright red, but you can just tell it just doesn't quite look right. And your eye's going to pick that up. So F gets me the feather controls, and this is a big shot. I'll just remind myself, this is 4 by 3K. And my general rule is at HD, which would be half this, or really a quarter of the frame, but half in each dimension, I would say that 2 pixels would be generally any edge. And these, it's a little hard to tell. There's a lot of gunk. This has heavy JPEG compression, but you can see everywhere, even things that are in focus, like he's in focus, but there's a lot of JPEG gunk on him. Everything's pretty much in focus, and I would say, if not 4, maybe 3 here. So the great thing is you can actually get reference right in your scene. All you have to do is look for anything that has a fairly sharp edge and then match that. So if you're looking at an image and it looks blurry, but specifically it looks like there's sort of halos around the edges, like color fringing, you may be dealing with chromatic aberration. Let's take a look. This is caused by the prismatic quality of a lens, which actually is bending light the same way a prism does and separating it out. And lenses correct for this, but in some ways the better the lens, and better means it's doing something extraordinary, the more likely it may be to do this. At the other end of the scale, cheap lenses or ones that don't fit the camera well will certainly also do this. Now, it seems to be highly divided, almost 50-50 out there, the number of people who focus on teaching you how to remove it, as the photographer has done here, versus those who would add it. And since you're a bunch of motion designers, I'm thinking you're going to want to add it. That is basically scaling and offsetting the color channels. You could do it manually in After Effects with the set channels effect and some scaling, or even optics compensation. You can mess with that. You also can get a third-party plugin. For example, our friends at Red Giant seem to be proponents of adding chromatic ab. It kind of gives it this feeling that you're pushing things really hard. Here's a photo that you may not recognize chromatic ab, and it was taken with a really good lens. And it also lets me talk a little bit about lens flares, which are another popular defect that people like to have in their shot. Lens flares, of course, vary by the lens. The type of flare that you get is totally dependent on the lens. And when you see little things like that, that is actually a reflection that is occurring right inside the lens. It's a little glint that's actually happening inside the lens housing. But the chromatic ab here, it's a little harder to spot, but you can see even when we were zoomed out, something just looks a little hazy about this otherwise beautiful image. The vignette is another lens effect / defect that way more people add to their shots than remove. And there's a simple way to recreate it. I mean, there are many different ways to do it, but let's just say I add a black solid the size of my frame. And now I go to my masks and double click, and then down in my timeline, I'm just going to invert that and feather it. And that's what a vignette looks like. If I want it to be closer in on my subjects, I can do that. And of course, if I want to lighten it up, I can do that too. So believe it or not, before about 1970 and the making of the film Easy Rider, lens flares in shots were considered a mistake and something that needed to be covered up, avoided, or cut out of the film. But long before that, there were filmmakers who also considered shallow depth of field to be a limitation, the most famous of whom was Greg Toland, the DP on Citizen Kane. Now, Toland and Orson Welles, the director, were so ambitious and so determined to make this film completely unique in its limitless depth of field that they invented their own camera rig and lenses for this movie. Now, certainly there are contemporaries of Orson Welles who made good use of shallow depth of field and the rack focus shot, where in a single framed shot you change the viewer's attention by just changing the focal point. Alfred Hitchcock comes to mind. But the example I want to show is Casino Royale, where you have an effect that is so well built into the character and the storyline. Now, I say effect. Of course, this wasn't a post-production effect. This is a lens effect. So I just love the way that as the viewer, I'm looking at James Bond as he's trying to figure out what's going on. And in the frame is the clue. And just by changing the focal point, we see him become aware of clear and present danger and figure out exactly what is going on. Now, it's probable that in a time before electricity and moving pictures, anyone looking at this moving image would have no idea what they were seeing. But you and I know these are lights at night that are defocused into bokeh blur. It's a combination of shallow depth of field and lens flare that gives you these kind of amazing abstract artifacts. Back in the day, I was a guest host often on the VFX Show podcast, and the very first episode that I guested on discussed the film Hitman, which you're seeing a sequence from here. And notice that virtually every shot is taken with shallow depth of field. Now, this was a low budget by the standards of an action movie. The way they maximized production value was to go to locations that were nice enough, but that looked so much better with all this interesting abstract art that gets created, particularly in the background, using shallow depth of field. All right, so now I want to shift gears and show you a little bit about a type of image that, if you don't know what you're looking at, will throw you off. That is the log image. It goes all the way back through the history of film being transferred to digital. And it stems from the time when the format was invented, basically because it was the only way to protect highlights when most of the images were just limited 8-bit. And the thing is that if you don't know how to handle these images and they do still come up, you may find yourself really fighting them. We've gone over a lot to do with HDR, LDR, and color management, but I want to call your attention to this image. This is Marcy. And no, Marcy's not a girl I used to date back in high school, although she's a real person named Marcy Ryland, who does actually sound like somebody you would have taken to prom sometime in the 20th century. Marcy was photographed by someone at Kodak, and this became a reference image for log footage. And log is a legacy of film. It's how film used to be transferred to digital, and the goal was to preserve highlights by flattening things out. But this isn't merely a low contrast image. So if I just go in and try to color correct it with, say, levels by adding contrast, it's not going to look that hot. You don't want to do that. So if you think you may be dealing with log footage, and you could very well, because, for example, the Aeroflex shoots log, and a lot of directors of photography really like working with log. They trust it. Then what you need to do is convert it. Now, there is a color management approach to this. So back in our color tab, I could choose a working space, for example, that handles ARRI log. And there are these numbers that have to do with the ISO. I'm going to pick something kind of mild, and these are all going to be in the ballpark. And when I choose that, After Effects recognizes that this is a DPX file and converts it. Now that looks not great to me. It's okay. That's probably not the right profile. So instead, what I would suggest is that you go to color correction, to the lumetri effect, and right at the top, under basic correction, you can choose and import LUT. A LUT is a lookup table. And what the LUT is telling us is what was the color intention that this was taken with. So I'll take the Alexa default. Alexa is that ARRI camera that I mentioned. And now she's looking kind of healthy. Image is not too blown out and hot. And some of these other settings maybe look even a bit better, but it's all a bit subjective. We're often looking at skin tones for what we like best here. And of course, now I could add my own color correction and I'm not fighting it. So just be aware if you see something that looks like it might not be a regular type of image, it looks a little flat, the gamma's a little low, you may be dealing with log, particularly if it's in the DPX format, which is a 10-bit image. One more word about LUTs, by the way. You can also set a color intention for the output. Now in Lumetri, there are also these looks. Some of them match film stock, so these would show you what the image would look like if, for example, you sent it to this film with this process done to it. They have numbers on them, so you really have to be kind of a nerd to follow this. But you just try them. And so printed to that film stock, this image would look more like that. And these are actually quite precise, particularly if you have your monitor calibrated. Now, there are others in here that are pure creative. So like we could go for the Gold Rush HDR look instead. And so sometimes I use those to put a temp look onto my footage, kind of a one-button solution. Lumetri also lets you do full color looking, but these are just presets that give you a specific look. And then you also can browse for a LUT. So if somebody sends you a LUT, and this will happen on high-end productions, this is a way to actually apply it to your image. So LUTs are your friend, and you can easily apply them also using the Apply Color LUT plugin, which is designed only to do that. There's more than one format, but most of the major ones are supported in After Effects. There are a bunch more things we haven't even brought up about the camera. Here are a few. Cameras can have filters in a matte box that sits in front of the lens. If you've ever seen this kind of accordion-like thing in front of the lens, that's what that is. And the filter might be really strong, like put a whole different color cast on the footage, and that's an artistic choice. The film stock, when film is involved, is the thing we were just looking at. And there's a corollary to that that I want to go over in After Effects, which is the digital transfer, which is usually no transfer at all. Usually you're working directly with the footage. But of course, we didn't go at all, and won't in this course, into stereo, which is 2 shots for your left and right eye, or VR, which is 360. And After Effects has some ability to handle both of those, but it's not something we're going to get into here. So one really cool thing in this course is we're providing you with predominantly our 3D files that we shot specifically for the course. It's cool that we shot them specifically for the course, but the fact that we shot our 3Ds and we're not converting them down to some other format for the most part is really great. That said, if we're going to hand you our 3Ds, I want you to know a little bit about the format so that you don't get yourself into any kind of trouble. The original footage taken for this course was taken with the RED camera. Now, the RED camera is a little bit different than any other camera out there. It's often referred to as the post-production camera. And the reason for that is it's designed to let you have the maximum amount of latitude to change things in post. So here are a couple of red R3D clips in my timeline. And the good news is Adobe apps handle this stuff natively, so they actually accelerate playback using your graphics card. But that's not what I'm here to talk about right now. Instead, I'm going to show you what happens if you go into Interpret Footage and under More Options with an R3D file selected, you're going to get this window. Now, this is a lot. It's even a lot for me. I think that what you have here are a bunch of fine adjustments that could have been made at some point. There is actually, you can see an adjustment that was made here to this curve to just drop the gamma in the blacks a little bit. And one could switch from this custom profile to the as shot profile, which isn't going to have that adjustment. Or one could change to something else. One could change to the red default, which has nothing to do with the settings that were used on the set. This can get, like color management, a little bit surreal, and you can definitely end up in the deep end here. But just remember, it's all about how the shot looks, and the difference between, for example, this or this is not much in any respect, including how it's going to key. So you probably almost certainly want to just leave this as is. And if you happen to mess with this and need to go back, you can go back to one of those settings and you'll be fine. And then if you're curious, you can go research and learn more about this, but it's not something we're going to need to get into. Okay, now the people who really need to know about red and all those color controls are DPs and to a certain extent colorists, producers who are technical minded, and pretty much anyone who is ambitious with the use of the format. For the most part, you're going to be fine, and you're probably not going to encounter footage other than maybe log that is corrected in a way where you're not still able to pretty easily bring it back. So here are a few talking points that could be worthy of an entire book that nobody would read. So instead, I'm going to keep them as quick talking points. The first has to do with alpha channels. Other compositing apps don't have this idea that After Effects has, that there's always an alpha channel. Transparency and selections are things that you assign, and when you do that, you specify whether they're pre-multiplied or straight. What the heck does that mean? To show you this, I'm actually going to go to Photoshop. So here we are at the pixel level. Those are individual pixels, and you can see the Photoshop checkerboard. So where you see checkerboard, there is background. This is a logo that's actually part of your first exercise. And so these are edge pixels. And if I were to save this out with an alpha channel, I would have a background color, most likely black. And so edge multiplication would cause this to look right against black. If I don't have edge multiplication, these might be fading to white and then suddenly go black and it look kind of weird. Multiplication allows the color to retain its quality even when you put it over black, where it effectively is disappearing to black. But in fact, if you put it over another color, you want to extract out the black. I think you get the idea. After Effects always works in straight behind the scenes, but most of the images you'll come across will be pre-multiplied. For the most part, After Effects gets this right. It can tell on import which kind of image you're working with, but occasionally you'll see white fringing, and that could be an edge multiplication problem. So you can actually go into Interpret Footage and change that if you need to. You'll probably never see it. Now, compression ratios and lossy codecs. So cameras will introduce compression to images for a couple different reasons. The main one being that they can't support a high enough data rate to be uncompressed. The sensor might melt down. The Red camera is pretty good, but even it can't go fully uncompressed. And the problem that people run into in visual effects is using cameras that introduce a lot of compression. So we shot on the Red camera, and every digital camera shoots with a codec. Well, I shouldn't say every camera, but virtually every digital camera shoots with a codec that is compressing and then later decompressing the image. It uses fewer bits. That allows it to record in real time. And the red does a really good job of getting a lot of information and not throwing a whole lot away. But there is a specific area where other cameras throw away information that can hurt your chances of, for example, pulling a good green screen key. 444 is what you would expect. You take any 4 pixels and each one has its own color data. But it turns out that your eye doesn't see color data as well as it does brightness data. And so what 422 does is throw away every other pixel's color data and keep just its luminance data. And that saves a lot of memory, but as you can imagine, it can wreak havoc with your edges. Even worse than that is 420, where 3 out of 4 pixels lose their color data and are averaged to just have the color of 1 pixel, even while retaining their individual brightness data. So Joey actually went ahead and tested this out, and we were looking at ProRes codecs specifically because we were going to output the footage that way. On the left, you see red footage converted to ProRes 4444, so that also includes the alpha channel. They're all with their full color. And on the right, you see what a color key looks like from the footage we were just looking at with 422. And I think you can see there's a good deal less detail, particularly in that halo, but all around, the edges are looking a little chewier. So that was visual proof that throwing away color damages things like green screen keys. All this is by way of saying, beware when you're getting ready for a VFX shoot that you're working with somebody who knows what camera to choose that won't throw away color data like that. If it was 5 or 10 years ago, I'd be having to warn everybody about using a DSLR to shoot their visual effects, because that was very popular when people had these cameras where the glass, the lens, makes the image look amazing, but when you try to push and pull on it in post, it falls apart. So just keep in mind that your eye can be fooled, but when you go to adjust the image, all the things that I'm pointing out technically in this lesson come into play. Linear light, we got into a little bit when we were looking at 32-bit per channel HDR. Linear light, also referred to as scene-referred light or scene-referred values, is light as it works in the natural world. On your computer, all your images get a gamma applied to them in order for them to look right. This is related, if you went to art school, to 18% gray being the gray that we actually perceive as middle gray versus having it down at 18%. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll only need to know about this as you get into linear light compositing, and for the most part, you probably won't. Motion designers like to make it a sport to use every blending mode. I mean, I even had a challenge one time with a guy to use dancing dissolve, which I dare you. For visual effects, there's only a handful really that are, I hate to say legit. Back in the day, optical compositing was done with the equivalent of just add and multiply, and certainly you can make use of lighten and screen and darken, or most of those darken effects. But below that, a lot of the ones lower in the menu, the ones that have to do with burn and dodge, or the light ones, really a little too hokey for things involving realism. They honestly were designed for print initially. And then you get back to ones that are super useful, like hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. So not really hard information there, just a friendly reminder of how professionals probably work with this. So go ahead and break my rules. So monitor precision and calibration is a thing you'll run into at high-end studios in general. At visual effects studios, you'll tend to have calibrated monitors. Higher-end studios also tend to work with image sequences and not with things like QuickTime. QuickTime is fragile in a visual effects facility. It's fine for dumping out a reference. The editor likes it, but when you're rendering on a render farm, You're creating frames. That way, if the render goes bad, you don't necessarily have to start the whole thing over. You're probably familiar with this, especially if you work with 3D rendering applications. You know, image sequences are really far superior to, say, QuickTime movies. If they break, there's only one frame that breaks. If you want to rewrite them, you don't have to start from scratch. You can just start wherever you needed to start or just replace a few frames really easily. They can hold more robust image formats. I could keep going. But the reality is motion designers and editors don't really like them because they're harder to deal with. And perhaps someday this will change, but for now, that is the reality. We've got a whole document of compositor lingo for you, but I'm going to call out a few terms that you're going to hear me use from time to time. And some of them are kind of old school, starting with plate, which goes back to optical compositing. This is effectively the master shot, which back in the day would have been mounted on a plate for other elements to be added onto it, like an actual photographic plate. So let's look at your project that you're going to be working on this weekend. So this is what you would call a green screen plate. You could call this an element because, in fact, you're going to be matting out just this foreground figure. And the background is going to be in Photoshop. So over here, we have a whole photographic-ish background and a logo element that you're going to be incorporating. So here we have a 2-shot sequence. Each one of these camera setups is a shot, and together they are telling a single story, or they're cut together to create a sequence. It's so basic I don't even know how to define it, but a feature film might have 40 to 60 sequences before you go to a different location, different point of time, what have you. A shot can have what are called handles. So you may hear me use this term. So beyond the used part of the shot, there might be some extra frames. In this case, this has been cut right down. But if you're ever asked for handles in a shot and you don't know what that is, those are extra frames at the top and tail, top, beginning, tail of the shot. And typically that's going to be 10, 15, at most 24 or 30 frames. They add extra work in visual effects, so you want to be mindful about whether handles are required. Editors like them because it lets you slip the timing a little bit. Now that's separate from padding, and padding is actual area on the frame. Right now we're cutting off her head over here, but imagine that this was meant to be a widescreen shot, then we would be cropping it at the top and bottom, and believe it or not, that is how that's done. When you see these widescreen movies, they are often shot even on a 4:3 plate, and then there's padding in the top and bottom around the used part of the shot. Why are we learning this stuff? To make you look good. You'll look good if you know your way around the camera and how it works, and you know what makes a cinematic image. Knowing the standards of cinema and how things are done at the highest end with visual images, or even what the standards are, will allow you to aspire to create images that could be in any level of feature film or commercial, and may one day be. Knowing the post-production process by working on these images gives you a lot of experience in how to plan and even imagine your own shoots. And knowing all the technical parts of After Effects that are involved with this will help you educate your clients and bid jobs intelligently. Whatever you're driven to create, you can be the best.